Daniel Morgan examined the rim of his coffee mug, noting the slight chip that had appeared months ago but somehow never warranted replacement. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows of their Aurora home, casting familiar patterns across the granite countertop, where his wife of 22 years stood with an envelope in her hands. "I want a divorce," Melissa said, sliding the papers across the counter with the practiced precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment. Daniel looked up, his IT consultant's mind already calculating, processing, the tremor in her left hand, the defensive posture, the carefully applied makeup at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning. He accepted the papers, his fingers steady as he unfolded the legal document ending their marriage. He read the terms methodically, his face betraying nothing while his mind replayed the evidence he'd been gathering for months. Credit card statements, hotel receipts, GPS coordinates. When he finally looked up, Daniel did something that clearly wasn't in Melissa's script. He smiled and reached for a pen. Daniel Morgan adjusted the collar of his button-down shirt as he waited for the coffee to finish brewing. Through the kitchen window of their Aurora home, the early Colorado sunlight cast long shadows across the carefully maintained backyard, a space that, like much of their marriage, had been meticulously designed but rarely enjoyed together. "Coffee's almost ready," he called out, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality that had become his default over the past several months. The wall clock, a wedding gift from Melissa's parents 22 years ago, ticked steadily, marking time in a home that had grown increasingly silent. As an IT consultant, Daniel appreciated systems, order, patterns. And lately, he'd noticed patterns that couldn't be ignored. Melissa appeared in the doorway, dressed more formally than her usual Tuesday warranted. She smoothed her blouse with slightly trembling hands. "I'm not having coffee this morning," she said, her voice pitched higher than normal. "I need to talk to you about something." Daniel nodded, pouring only one cup. He noted how she clutched her leather portfolio, the one she used for important client meetings, against her chest like armor. "Is everything okay?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "I think we should sit down," Melissa replied, gesturing toward the dining room table, another space rarely used except for holidays and the occasional dinner party with colleagues. Daniel followed her, coffee in hand, watching as she placed the portfolio precisely in the center of the polished mahogany surface, aligning its edges with the grain of the wood. The divorce papers lay between them, like a physical manifestation of the distance that had grown over years. Daniel stared at the legal document, its formal language reducing their 22 years to a series of clauses, terms, and conditions. "I've been unhappy for a long time, Daniel," Melissa said, her voice wavering between rehearsed certainty and unexpected doubt. "We both have been." He studied her face. The careful makeup, the way she'd styled her hair, the way he once mentioned he liked. Details that seemed incongruous with the moment. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked, his voice calm, almost clinical. Melissa shifted in her chair. "That's not important. What matters is that this is best for both of us. My lawyer says we can make this simple if we're both reasonable." Daniel picked up the papers, noting the law firm's letterhead, the same firm where her gym friend Mark worked, the same Mark whose number appeared repeatedly on their phone bill after 11 p.m. "You've signed already," he observed, turning the pages methodically. "Yes." Her eyes searched his face for the reaction she'd clearly anticipated: anger, pleading, shock. "There's a pen in the portfolio if you... whenever you're ready." Daniel reached for the pen, an expensive one he'd given her for their 15th anniversary. He uncapped it deliberately, the small click echoing in the silent room. "You're not going to fight this?" Melissa asked, confusion creeping into her voice. Daniel met her eyes with a steady gaze. What would be the point? He signed his name on each marked line with the same care he might use signing a routine contract at work. His handwriting remained perfectly even, betraying none of the knowledge he carried. The hotel receipts, the unexplained charges, the GPS locations that never matched her stories. When he finished, he recapped the pen and placed it beside the papers, sliding them back toward her. "Is that it?" Melissa asked, clearly thrown by his composure. "Unless there's something else you need from me," Daniel replied, taking a sip of his cooling coffee. Daniel stood, picking up his coffee mug. "I'll be moved out by the weekend." Melissa's head jerked up. "You found a place already?" "I signed a lease last week," he said, moving toward the kitchen. He rinsed his mug methodically, placing it in the dishwasher rather than leaving it in the sink as he sometimes did. "Last week?" Her voice followed him. "How did you know?" Daniel turned, leaning against the counter. "I've always believed in being prepared." He moved past her to the hallway closet, retrieving his laptop bag and jacket with deliberate calm. Melissa followed, her confidence visibly shaken by his lack of resistance. "What about our things, the house? There's so much to discuss," she said, her planned script clearly derailed. "We can discuss the details later," Daniel replied, checking his watch. "I have a client meeting at 9. He selected his keys from the bowl by the door, deliberately taking only his car key and house key, leaving behind the small silver heart keychain she'd given him years ago. "Daniel," Melissa said, her voice smaller now, "I didn't expect you to take this so calmly." He paused at the door, studying her face for a moment. The woman he'd shared his life with, who now seemed like a stranger wearing a familiar face. "Life rarely goes according to our expectations, does it?" he said, his tone neither bitter nor angry, simply matter of fact. As he stepped onto the porch, adjusting his jacket against the morning chill, Daniel allowed himself the smallest smile. Not of happiness, but of the quiet dignity that comes with choosing one's own response rather than following someone else's script. "I'll call you about picking up my things," he said, closing the door gently behind him. 3 weeks before Melissa presented the divorce papers, Daniel sat alone in his home office, the blue glow of his computer monitor casting shadows across his face. It was nearly midnight, a time he often used to catch up on household finances while Melissa slept. He navigated through their joint credit card statement, methodically categorizing expenses for his monthly budget spreadsheet. Restaurant charges, utility payments, subscriptions, all usual suspects in their financial landscape. He was about to close the browser when a charge from the Hyatt Regency caught his attention. $312.76. Daniel frowned, scrolling back through his calendar. No business trips that week, no family visits that would require a hotel. He checked his email for confirmations. Nothing. He opened a new browser tab and logged into their shared mobile account, scanning Melissa's call history. Multiple calls to the same number, always after he'd left for work or late at night. The pattern stood out to his trained eye like a security breach in a network. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, a cold weight settling in his stomach. He could call the hotel, ask about the charge. He could confront Melissa directly. But something, professional instinct or self-preservation, made him pause. Instead, he created a new folder on his encrypted external hard drive. He named it Financial Review 2025 and took a screenshot of the credit card statement. His IT consultant's mind clicked into problem-solving mode even as his husband's heart began to crack. That single anomaly would have been easy to dismiss. But Daniel knew that in data analysis, patterns tell stories. Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel constructed his investigation with the same methodical precision he applied to troubleshooting complex systems for his clients. Each evening, while Melissa attended her book club or worked late, he gathered digital breadcrumbs. He created a spreadsheet tracking the unexplained hotel charges. 3 different establishments over 2 months, always on Tuesdays or Thursdays. He correlated these with Melissa's calendar events and her text message patterns, noting the gaps in communication that aligned perfectly with the hotel timestamps. One night, he connected her phone to their home computer under the pretense of transferring photos. While the images copied, he quietly installed tracking software. The next day, he reviewed the GPS data, watching the digital dot of her location hovering for hours at an address that wasn't her office, wasn't the gym, wasn't anywhere she had mentioned. Daniel printed bank statements, highlighted restaurant charges for meals he hadn't shared. He documented the increasing frequency of girls' nights that never appeared in any of her friends' social media posts. He noted new clothing purchases that he never saw her wear at home. With each piece of evidence collected, the clinical detachment he had maintained began to crack. His hands trembled slightly as he placed each new document into the expanding folder. The systematic organization couldn't contain the growing hollowness in his chest. On the 15th day of his investigation, Daniel discovered a recurring charge for a second phone line he had never known about. When he called the provider, they cheerfully confirmed that yes, Mrs. Morgan had added the line 3 months ago. That night, he sat alone in his office, the complete evidence folder open before him, the weight of irrefutable proof pressing down on his shoulders. Daniel closed the folder, rubbing his eyes beneath his glasses. 22 years of marriage, reduced to a collection of betrayal receipts. The anger he had expected came in waves, then receded, leaving behind a strange clarity. "What now?" he whispered to the empty room. He could confront her with the evidence, demand explanations, engage in the predictable cycle of denial, argument, tearful confession. He imagined the drama unfolding, the shouting, the promises to change, the couples therapy that would follow, the performance of reconciliation. A memory surfaced. His grandfather sitting on the porch of their family home, his weathered hands cradling a glass of lemonade. Daniel had been 16, devastated by his first heartbreak. "The measure of a man isn't found in how loudly he fights," his grandfather had said, "but in how carefully he chooses his battles, and how quietly he walks away from those not worth fighting." Daniel ran his fingers along the edge of his wedding band. He had always prided himself on his strategic thinking, his ability to see multiple steps ahead. The emotional chess match of confrontation would drain him, might even temporarily satisfy Melissa's need for drama. And to what end? No, there was another path. One that preserved his dignity. He removed his wedding ring, placing it beside the evidence folder. Then he opened his laptop and began researching apartment listings in North Aurora. He made an appointment to see one the next morning before work. He checked his personal savings account, the one Melissa didn't know about, confirming he had enough for a deposit and first month's rent. The painful knot in his chest didn't disappear, but it transformed into something more manageable. A dull ache cushioned by purpose and clarity. By morning, when he heard Melissa's alarm chime from their bedroom, Daniel had already decided he would wait. When she made her move, he would be ready with his response, not in anger, but in quiet, prepared dignity. Daniel stirred the pasta sauce with practiced precision adjusting the heat on the stovetop as he heard Melissa's car pull into the garage. Tuesday night pasta had been their tradition for over a decade. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose. "Something smells amazing," Melissa said as she entered the kitchen, setting her purse on the counter. Her smile seemed rehearsed, her eyes not quite meeting his. "Just the usual," Daniel replied, his voice neutral. "How was your day?" "Busy. That Johnson account is taking forever to close." She poured herself a glass of wine, the same Cabernet they'd discovered on their 15th anniversary trip. "What about you?" Daniel seasoned the sauce, each movement deliberate, productive, finished the security upgrade for that medical office. He set the wooden spoon down and reached for plates in the cabinet they'd selected together years ago. On the windowsill sat the small chess set his father had given him, a piece of decoration Melissa had always found pretentious, but he'd insisted on keeping. He glanced at it now, the white knight positioned strategically among the black pieces. "Dinner in 5, he said, draining the pasta. They ate at the kitchen island rather than the dining room, exchanging pleasantries about weather and neighbors. Daniel noticed how Melissa checked her phone 3 times, angling it away from his view. He pretended not to notice, just as he pretended not to see the small hickey partially concealed by her collar. "I might be late tomorrow," she said, twirling pasta around her fork. "Team meeting that could run long." Daniel nodded. "No problem. I've got that networking event anyway." There was no networking event. There was an apartment viewing and a meeting with his bank. But in this moment, they were both playing their parts in a production neither would acknowledge was fiction. The apartment was on the north side of Aurora, 15 minutes from his office, but far enough from their neighborhood to avoid accidental encounters. Daniel walked through the space with Ms. Peterson, the property manager, noting the practical layout and abundant natural light. "It's available immediately," he confirmed, standing by the living room window that overlooked a small park. "Yes, Mr. Morgan, we just finished renovations last week." She handed him an application form. It's unusual to find someone looking to move so quickly without having sold their current home. Daniel offered a measured smile. Sometimes, life changes require adaptability. After completing the paperwork and writing a check for the deposit, he stood alone in what would soon be his new living room. The emptiness echoed around him, a blank canvas, both liberating and daunting. Later that afternoon, he sat across from Mr. Westfield at First Colorado Bank, sliding a cashier's check across the desk. "I'd like to close the joint account and transfer these funds to my personal account," Daniel explained. The banker's eyes flickered with practiced neutrality. "I see you've already withdrawn exactly half the balance." "Yes, the remainder belongs to my wife." "Will Mrs. Morgan be joining us to sign the closure documents?" "No, this is my portion only." Daniel placed his debit card on the desk. "I won't be needing this anymore." As Mr. Westfield processed the transaction, Daniel glanced at his watch, a graduation gift from his parents, predating his relationship with Melissa. One of the few things in his life that carried no connection to the marriage now ending. He accepted the new account information, tucking it carefully into his wallet alongside the apartment key Ms. Peterson had provided. Small, tangible symbols of his imminent independence. "Good luck with everything, Mr. Morgan," the banker said, shaking his hand. Daniel nodded. Sometimes a clean break is the best solution. The text message arrived as Daniel was preparing dinner alone, Melissa having texted that she would be working late. His phone chimed with the distinctive tone he'd assigned to Alan Peterson, his friend of 15 years and their accountant. "Hey, Dan. Sorry to bother you after hours. Did you authorize Melissa to withdraw $15K from your investment account today? Just checking, since it's outside your normal pattern. Daniel stared at the message, knife frozen above the cutting board. He hadn't accessed that account in months. With measured movements, he set down the knife and pulled up the investment portal on his phone, entering his credentials. There it was, a $15,000 withdrawal processed at 2:17 p.m. He opened his evidence folder on his laptop, cross-referencing hotel expenses. A pattern emerged. Not just any hotels, but increasingly expensive ones. The most recent charge from the Four Seasons. Daniel opened his email, finding the quarterly invitation to the neighborhood poker night he'd been too busy to attend lately. He scrolled through the recipient list, then checked it against Melissa's recent text messages. The connection hit him like a physical blow. Mark Sullivan, his poker buddy for 8 years. The same Mark whose legal firm was handling Melissa's divorce filing. The same Mark whose wife Lisa had hosted their holiday party last year, handing Daniel a glass of eggnog with a smile while his own wife and her husband carried on their affair. The betrayal expanded beyond his marriage into his community, poisoning friendships and memories he'd valued for years. The Christmas ornament the Sullivans had given them sat on the counter, still in the donation box he'd been meaning to drop off. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the ornament, a ceramic house with "Friends make life a home" inscribed on the base. He stared at it, feeling the foundation of his social world crumbling alongside his marriage. Yet even as the pain threatened to overwhelm him, Daniel felt his resolve hardening. If the betrayal extended beyond Melissa to their friends, then his response needed to be even more carefully orchestrated. Not from vengeance, but from the deeper need to preserve what remained of his dignity. He placed the ornament back in the box, his movements deliberate once more. The chess player in him recognized this not as a reason to abandon his strategy, but as critical intelligence requiring an even more precise execution. Daniel stood in the bedroom he had shared with Melissa for 22 years, an empty cardboard box open at his feet. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the carefully tended yard they had argued over countless Saturdays. He ran his fingers along the spines of books on the shelf, selecting only 3. His grandfather's leather-bound collection of Thoreau, a dog-eared first edition of The Art of Computer Security that had launched his career, and the travel journal from his solo hiking trip to Colorado that had brought him to Aurora in the first place. He moved to the closet, bypassing expensive suits they had shopped for together, reaching instead for his well-worn hiking boots and the jacket his father had given him before he passed. From the dresser, he selected only clothes he had purchased himself, leaving behind anything Melissa had chosen. In the home office, he carefully disconnected his personal laptop and external hard drives, leaving the desktop computer they shared. His eyes lingered on the framed certifications and degrees hanging on the wall, evidence of a career built while supporting their life together. He removed only his graduate degree, leaving the achievement awards they had celebrated as a couple. From the living room, Daniel selected the small chess set, a handcrafted wooden bowl from their one genuine vacation without phones or schedules, and a single photograph, not of their wedding, but of a fishing trip with his late father. He heard Melissa's uncertain footsteps pause in the doorway, but didn't turn around. "You're really not taking much," she observed, her voice carrying a note of surprise. Daniel carefully wrapped the photograph in a soft cloth. "I'm taking what matters." Daniel placed the last box in the trunk of his car, the space still half empty, despite containing everything he had deemed essential from his previous life. The afternoon had faded toward evening, shadows lengthening across the driveway where he had washed their cars most Sundays. He closed the trunk with a decisive click, the sound echoing in the suburban quiet. 3 boxes and a suitcase, a surprisingly compact package for half a lifetime. Melissa stood on the porch, arms crossed protectively across her chest, watching with an expression that shifted between confusion and growing unease. Her script had called for anger, for drama, for a struggle that would validate her decision. His calm efficiency had stolen her narrative. "Your attorney can contact mine about the house and the rest of it," Daniel said, his voice steady as he pocketed his car keys. "Where will you go?" she asked, the question revealing more vulnerability than she likely intended. "I've found a place," he replied simply. Just like that. After 22 years? Daniel looked at the house they had selected together, the garden they had planted, the life they had constructed, the facade that had concealed so much deception. "It wasn't just like that, Melissa. Nothing ever is." He walked toward his car, each step measured and deliberate, refusing to rush despite the heaviness gathering in his chest. At the driver's door, he paused, turning back toward the woman who had been the center of his world for over 2 decades. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said, the words offering neither forgiveness nor condemnation, merely acknowledgement. As he drove away, Daniel resisted the urge to check the rearview mirror. Some thresholds, once crossed, were not meant for looking back. The road ahead carried him away from the familiar streets of their neighborhood toward an unfamiliar future he had never planned for, but now embraced with quiet determination. The apartment echoed with emptiness as Daniel set his boxes on the bare floor. White walls, unadorned windows, the smell of recent paint and carpet cleaner, all marking a space untouched by memory or connection. The property manager had left a single key on the kitchen counter beside a folder containing building information and maintenance contacts. He moved through the rooms, his footsteps resonating in the unfurnished space. The bedroom where no shared dreams had been whispered. The living room where no Christmas mornings had been celebrated. The kitchen where no anniversaries had been toasted. Daniel unpacked his meager possessions, placing each item deliberately. The chess set on the windowsill, the wooden bowl on the counter, the 3 books stacked neatly beside his sleeping bag on the bedroom floor, the photograph of his father propped against the wall. When everything was arranged, the emptiness remained overwhelming. The strategic victory of his dignity-preserving exit now confronted the emotional reality of starting over at 53. The quiet was absolute. No familiar creaks of an aging house, no distant sound of a spouse moving through shared spaces. He sat on the floor, back against the wall, and for the first time since discovering Melissa's betrayal, allowed himself to feel the full weight of loss. Not just of her, but of the future he had planned, the retirement they had saved for, the grandchildren they might have shared. The darkness outside the uncurtained windows deepened, casting the apartment in shadow. Daniel remained motionless, his carefully constructed composure finally cracking in the safety of solitude. The tears, when they came, were silent. The grief of a private man facing the void his strategic wisdom had navigated him toward, but couldn't fill. When the tears subsided, Daniel wiped his face with methodical dignity and looked around the empty space, a physical manifestation of the blank page his life had become. The strategic chess player had executed a perfect defense, protecting his most valuable pieces, but now faced the harder challenge, determining what move to make next in a game with no clear opponent and no defined path to victory. In the darkness, the question hung unanswered. What did winning even mean now? Yet somewhere beneath the emptiness, barely perceptible but undeniably present, lay the faint outline of possibility. A life rewritten on his own terms, unburdened by deception. A thin thread of potential, not yet strong enough to grasp, but present nonetheless. Morning light filtered through the uncurtained bathroom window, casting angular patterns across the tile floor. Daniel stood at the sink, preparing for his first day of work since the separation. The routine was familiar: shaving cream, razor, careful strokes. But the surroundings were foreign, stripped of the accumulated comforts of a shared life. He wiped steam from the mirror and paused, truly seeing himself for perhaps the first time in years. The face looking back at him seemed simultaneously familiar and strange, the same features he had always known, now carrying new lines of experience. Who was this man, separated from the identity of husband? What remained when that defining role was removed? For 22 years, he had been Daniel Morgan, Melissa's husband, IT consultant, homeowner in Aurora. Now 3 of those anchors had been cut loose. Only his professional identity remained intact. Daniel studied his reflection as water dripped from his freshly shaved jaw. His father's eyes looked back at him, the same steady gaze that had weathered his own life's storms. His grandfather's brow lined with the weight of decisions made and paths chosen. The realization struck him with unexpected force. He was not just the sum of his relationships and roles. Before he was a husband, before he was half of Daniel and Melissa, he had been formed by generations of men and women who had faced their own trials. His hand trembled slightly as he wiped the remaining shaving cream from his face. The mirror reflected not just his present solitude, but a lineage of resilience he had nearly forgotten. The water circling the drain carried away more than just the remnants of his morning routine. It seemed to wash away some of the isolation that had settled over him in the empty apartment. He was not starting from nothing. He was continuing a story that had begun long before him. Daniel finished dressing and moved to the living room where he had arranged his few possessions. The morning light now bathed the sparse space in a golden glow, softening the stark emptiness. He picked up his grandfather's leather-bound collection of Thoreau, feeling the worn cover beneath his fingers. Tucked between the pages was an old photograph he had placed there years ago. His grandfather Thomas, standing beside a small cabin he had built after his own life had been upended. Daniel sat on the floor, cross-legged, and studied the image. The man's weathered face bore a quiet dignity despite the circumstances that had driven him to that solitary place. The memory surfaced with startling clarity. Sitting on his grandfather's porch at 16, devastated by his first heartbreak, listening to the old man's story for the first time. "Your grandmother wasn't my first love, Danny," Thomas had said, his calloused hands wrapped around a glass of lemonade. "Before her, there was Eleanor. And we were engaged to be married when I discovered she'd been carrying on with my cousin behind my back." Young Daniel had been shocked. "What did you do, Grandpa?" "What everyone expected. At first, I shouted, threw things, made a proper fool of myself." Thomas's eyes had crinkled at the corners. "Then I went away to that cabin you've seen in the photos. Built it with these hands while I figured out who I was, apart from the man who'd been betrayed." "Did you ever forgive her?" Daniel had asked. "Forgiveness isn't about erasing what happened, son. It's about not letting it determine who you become." Thomas had leaned forward. "The measure of a man isn't found in how he handles victory, but in how he rises after defeat. Your grandmother found me 2 years later, when I'd rebuilt myself stronger than before." Daniel ran his fingers over the photograph, remembering how his grandfather and grandmother had shared a love so deep it had seemed to transcend ordinary human connection, a love born not from naive youth, but from mature choice and clear-eyed wisdom. "I see now, Grandpa," Daniel whispered to the empty room. I'm finally understanding what you tried to teach me." He carefully returned the photograph to the book, but instead of reshelving it, he placed it on the small table beside his sleeping bag. A reminder that the path through darkness had been walked before by his own blood and had led to unexpected light. Daniel was arranging his minimal kitchen supplies when his phone rang. The sound seemed almost intrusive in the quiet apartment. He glanced at the screen, his heart skipping when he saw his son's name. Jason rarely called, their relationship having grown distant during the last years of the marriage. "Jason," he answered, unable to keep the surprise from his voice. "Dad?" There was a pause, heavy with unspoken questions. "Mom told me what happened, that you moved out." Daniel leaned against the counter, unsure how to navigate this conversation. His relationship with his 25-year-old son had become increasingly strained, as Jason had watched his parents' marriage deteriorate without understanding the underlying causes. "Yes," he said simply, "I have my own place now." "She said you just signed the papers. No fighting, no arguing." Jason's voice carried confusion, tinged with something else, perhaps respect. "That doesn't sound like you and Mom. You two argued about what brand of coffee to buy." Daniel found himself smiling slightly at the observation. Sometimes the biggest decisions require the least debate. Another pause. "Are you okay?" "Really okay?" The question caught Daniel off guard. When was the last time Jason had asked about his well-being with such genuine concern? Daniel looked around at his sparse apartment, thinking of his grandfather's photograph. "Finding my way, one day at a time." "Do you need anything? Help moving stuff?" "I traveled light," Daniel replied, "but I wouldn't mind some company, if you wanted to stop by sometime." "Actually," Jason said, his voice gaining confidence, "I'm free tomorrow evening. We could grab dinner or something, if you want." Daniel felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the morning sunlight now filling the apartment. "I'd like that very much." "Great. I'll text you tomorrow about time." Jason paused again. "And Dad, I'm sorry things turned out this way." "Don't be," Daniel said, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. Sometimes endings make space for beginnings we couldn't have imagined. After they disconnected, Daniel stood in the kitchen, phone still in hand, feeling the first genuine stirring of possibility since signing the divorce papers. His marriage had ended, but perhaps, just perhaps, a more authentic relationship with his son was only beginning. Daniel arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early, selecting a corner table that offered both privacy and a view of the entrance. The cafe bustled with afternoon customers, strangers whose lives continued undisturbed by the seismic shifts in his own. When Jason walked in, Daniel was struck by how much his son resembled his younger self. The same serious set to his shoulders, the thoughtful eyes that missed little. There was an awkward moment as Jason spotted him, a hesitation before approaching, as if crossing an invisible boundary. "Hey, Dad." Jason slid into the chair opposite, setting his phone face down on the table, a small gesture of attention Daniel hadn't seen in years. "Thanks for coming," Daniel said, pushing a coffee across the table. "Still take it black?" Jason nodded, surprised. "You remembered. Some things stay with you." They sat in silence for a moment, the background chatter filling the space between them. "So," Jason finally said, "are you going to tell me what really happened?" Daniel considered his words carefully. "Your mother and I grew apart in ways that couldn't be bridged." "That's the official story. I'm asking for the truth." Daniel sipped his coffee. "The truth isn't always simple, Jason, and some details aren't mine alone to share." "Were you unhappy? You never seemed unhappy." Appearances can be misleading, Daniel replied. Sometimes we maintain them so long we forget what's beneath. Jason studied his father's face. You knew before she handed you the papers, didn't you? You weren't surprised. Daniel met his son's gaze directly. I'd rather talk about you. How's the new job going? Don't change the subject, Jason said, then softened. But it's good, challenging, the kind of work that keeps you up at night for the right reasons. Daniel smiled genuinely. That's what you always wanted. What do you want now, Dad? After all this? The question caught Daniel off guard. I'm still figuring that out. But sitting here with you, this is a good start. Jason's expression shifted, a vulnerability appearing beneath his composed exterior. I'm sorry I haven't been around much these last few years. I guess I sensed something was wrong and didn't want to face it. We're here now, Daniel said simply. That's what matters. As they continued talking, the initial awkwardness gradually melted away. Jason spoke about his work, his girlfriend, his plans. Daniel listened with an engagement that had been absent in their recent interactions, asking questions that revealed genuine interest rather than paternal obligation. We should do this again, Jason said, as they prepared to leave, the statement carrying the weight of reconnection. Daniel nodded, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. I'd like that very much. 3 days later, Daniel was reviewing client documentation at a small cafe near his office when a familiar perfume reached him seconds before Melissa appeared, sliding into the chair across from him without invitation. Daniel. Her voice carried a practiced softness he recognized from their marriage, the tone she used when she wanted something. He closed his laptop, maintaining a neutral expression. Melissa, this is unexpected. She looked different somehow, more carefully put together than usual, her makeup precise, her clothing selected for impact. I've been trying to reach you. You didn't return my calls. I thought everything was being handled through the attorneys. His voice remained even, neither cold nor inviting. This isn't about legal matters. She twisted her wedding ring, which she still wore. I've been doing a lot of thinking. Daniel waited, neither encouraging nor discouraging her to continue. I made a terrible mistake, she said, leaning forward. With the divorce, with everything. Mark turned out to be... She paused, recalibrating. It wasn't what I thought it would be. I'm sorry to hear that, Daniel said, and found he genuinely meant it. Her eyes widened slightly at his response. The thing is, I've realized what I threw away. 22 years, Daniel. That's not something to discard lightly. No, it isn't. We could try again, she said, reaching for his hand across the table. People make mistakes. They find their way back. Daniel gently withdrew his hand, placing it on his closed laptop. Melissa, what we had is over. You don't mean that. You're angry, hurt. I'm not angry, he interrupted, surprising himself with the truth of it. And yes, there was hurt. But this isn't about punishment or spite. Then what is it about? A hint of the old frustration colored her voice. It's about recognizing when something is truly broken, not just cracked. Daniel maintained steady eye contact. It's about respecting myself enough to walk away from deception rather than inviting more of it. People can change, she insisted, tears forming in her carefully made-up eyes. Yes, they can, he agreed. And perhaps we both needed to, just not together. Her composure fractured slightly. So that's it? 22 years, and you just walk away? No, Daniel said quietly. 22 years, and I choose a different path forward. One with authenticity at its core. As he gathered his laptop, Melissa reached for his arm. "Daniel, please. At least think about it." He paused, looking at her with compassion rather than resentment. "I wish you well, Melissa. I truly do. But my answer won't change." He left her sitting there, the boundary between them now clear. Not a wall built of anger, but a line drawn from self-respect. Daniel's apartment had begun to take shape. A simple sofa and reading chair occupied the living room, bookshelves stood half-filled, and the kitchen now contained the basic necessities. He and Jason sat at the small dining table he had purchased second-hand, sharing takeout from the Thai restaurant they had both always preferred. "Mom came to see you," Jason said, not a question, but a statement. Daniel nodded, setting down his fork. "She told you?" "Called me right after. She was upset." Jason studied his father's face. "Said you were being stubborn." A smile touched Daniel's lips. "That's not an unfamiliar assessment." "Are you?" Jason asked. "Being stubborn, I mean." Daniel considered the question. There's a difference between stubbornness and clarity, between closing a door out of spite and recognizing it leads somewhere you no longer wish to go. "She seems to think you might reconsider." Hope can be persistent, even when misplaced. Daniel chose his next words carefully. "Your mother is facing consequences she didn't anticipate. That's difficult." Jason's expression revealed surprise. "You sound almost sympathetic." "Compassion doesn't require reconciliation," Daniel said. "Understanding someone's pain doesn't mean you're responsible for alleviating it." "That's surprisingly wise, Dad." Jason set down his fork. "Growing up, I always thought Mom was the emotionally intelligent one, and you were just logical, clinical." "We show different faces to different people," Daniel replied. "Sometimes even to ourselves." Jason was quiet for a moment. "I always worried I'd turn out like you, so controlled, so measured. But sitting here now, I'm thinking maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing after all." The unexpected acknowledgement warmed Daniel more than he could express. We inherit more than just features from our parents. The trick is choosing which qualities to nurture. Their conversation drifted to lighter topics. Jason's weekend plans, a documentary Daniel had watched. The ease between them felt like a rediscovered treasure, valuable in its unexpectedness. As they were clearing the takeout containers, Jason's phone buzzed with a text. His expression darkened as he read it. "Everything okay?" Daniel asked. "It's Mom," Jason said, looking up with concern. "She's outside. Says she needs to talk to both of us. Something about family healing." Before Daniel could respond, an insistent knocking echoed through the apartment. Jason looked to his father, uncertainty in his eyes. "Dad?" Daniel took a deep breath, steeling himself for the confrontation he had hoped to avoid. "It seems some boundaries need to be reinforced." The knocking came again, more forceful this time, as Daniel moved toward the door, his newfound connection with his son about to face its first significant test. Daniel opened the door to find Melissa standing in the hallway, makeup slightly smudged from tears, her posture both defiant and desperate. Jason stood behind his father, tension evident in his stance. "Melissa," Daniel said evenly, "this isn't a good time. It's never a good time anymore, is it?" She pushed past him into the apartment, her gaze sweeping critically over the modest furnishings. "So this is what you left me for? This emptiness?" "Mom," Jason began, "maybe we should—" "No, Jason. Your father needs to hear this." Melissa turned to Daniel, eyes blazing. "You walked away from everything we built, our home, our life, our future, without even trying to fix it." Daniel closed the door quietly. creating a private space for the confrontation. That's not what happened, and I think you know that. What I know, she said, voice rising, is that marriages take work. People make mistakes, terrible mistakes. But you don't just throw away 22 years. I didn't throw it away, Daniel replied, maintaining his calm. That choice was made long before I signed those papers. One affair doesn't erase 2 decades, Daniel. People recover from worse every day. Jason shifted uncomfortably. Mom, I don't think— It's okay, Jason, Daniel said gently, before turning back to Melissa. This isn't just about an affair. It's about trust, respect, and the kind of life I want to live going forward. The kind where you're alone in a bland apartment? Melissa gestured around her. This is better than our life together? Sometimes, Daniel said quietly, what appears empty actually contains possibility. Melissa's composure fractured, her voice dropping to a whisper. He left me, Daniel. After everything I sacrificed, after what I did to us, he just left. The revelation hung in the air, Daniel's expression softening slightly. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you? Her eyes searched his face. Or are you glad I'm suffering the same way you did? Daniel met her gaze steadily. Your pain doesn't bring me joy, Melissa. It never would. The sincerity in his voice seemed to reach her, creating a momentary pause in her storm of emotions. Melissa sank onto Daniel's sofa, the fight suddenly draining from her. Jason glanced at his father, who nodded slightly, giving him permission to stay for what would come next. Mark said he was in love with me, she said, staring at her hands. Said his marriage was dead, just like ours supposedly was. We were going to start over together, a clean slate. Daniel sat in the chair opposite her, keeping a respectful distance. What changed? Reality, she laughed bitterly. Once it wasn't secret anymore. Once it wasn't stolen moments and fantasy. He realized he wasn't ready to leave his comfortable life, his practice, his reputation in the community. Daniel absorbed this information without visible reaction, though Jason's expression darkened with protective anger. When I told him I'd given you the divorce papers, that it was done, Melissa continued, he panicked, said we should slow things down, that I'd moved too quickly. Her voice broke. 2 days later, he said he was recommitting to his marriage, for his children's sake. I'm sorry, Daniel said again, and meant it. Are you? Melissa looked up, vulnerability replacing defiance. Because I destroyed everything for nothing, Daniel. Everything. Not for nothing, Daniel replied gently. For something you believed would make you happy. But it didn't. Tears spilled down her cheeks. And now I've lost you too. Jason moved closer to his mother, torn between comforting her and his growing respect for his father's composure. I keep thinking, Melissa said, wiping her tears, if I could just make you understand how sorry I am, if we could just go back. We can't go back, Daniel interrupted, his voice kind but firm. And even if we could, I wouldn't want to. You don't mean that, she whispered. I do, he said, leaning forward slightly, because what we had wasn't what I thought it was, and what I'm discovering now about myself, about life, that's something I wouldn't trade. Melissa studied his face, seeing for perhaps the first time the change in him, a clarity and strength that hadn't been visible during their marriage. You're different, she said softly. Yes, Daniel agreed. I am. A stillness settled over the apartment as the three of them sat in the truth that had finally emerged. Outside, streetlights cast long shadows through the uncurtained windows, marking the passage of time in this suspended moment. "What happens now?" Melissa finally asked, her voice steadier. "You move forward," Daniel said. "Just as I am, different paths, but both moving forward." Jason, who had been silent through much of the exchange, spoke up. "Dad's right, Mom. You can't undo what happened, but you don't have to let it define everything that comes next." Melissa looked at her son with surprise, then back to Daniel. "You two seem closer." "We're working on it," Daniel said, exchanging a glance with Jason. "Sometimes breakage creates space for new connections." "And us?" Melissa asked. "Is there anything left?" Daniel considered her question carefully. "There's respect. There's wishing you well. There's the shared history of raising a son we both love. But not the marriage. That's truly finished." She nodded slowly, acceptance beginning to replace desperation. "I don't know how to start over at our age." "Neither did I," Daniel admitted. "But I'm learning that it's less about starting over and more about continuing differently." Jason helped his mother to her feet. "I'll drive you home, Mom." Melissa gathered herself, smoothing her clothing with dignity. At the door, she turned back to Daniel. "I really am sorry for everything." "I know," he said, "and I forgive you, not because it erases what happened, but because holding on to resentment would only continue the damage. We both deserve better than that." Her eyes widened slightly at his words. "When did you get so wise?" Daniel smiled softly. Perhaps it was always there, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. After they left, Daniel stood at the window, watching as Jason helped Melissa into his car. The streetlight illuminated them briefly before they drove away, his past and his future in a single frame. He felt neither victory nor loss, but something more profound. The peace that comes from choosing one's own response to life's unexpected turns. As their taillights disappeared around the corner, Daniel turned back to his apartment. What had seemed empty now appeared full of possibility, each space waiting to be filled with authentic choices rather than compromise. The signature he had placed on those divorce papers weeks ago hadn't been an ending after all. It had been the first stroke in writing a new chapter entirely his own. 3 months after Melissa's final visit, Daniel's apartment had transformed into a true home. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with both familiar volumes and new discoveries. Photographs, mostly of Jason, a few of Daniel's parents and grandfather, adorned another. The kitchen, once stark and institutional, now housed cooking implements and the warm aromas of the dinner Daniel prepared as Jason set the table. "I still can't believe you learned to cook," Jason said, arranging silverware beside hand-thrown pottery plates Daniel had purchased from a local artist. Daniel smiled, stirring the simmering pot. "Your grandfather always said crisis either diminishes us or expands us. I decided to expand." They sat across from each other, the golden evening light streaming through windows, now dressed with simple linen curtains. Jason sampled the food, his expression appreciative. "You know what's strange?" Jason said, setting down his fork. "I feel like I know you better now than I ever did growing up." "Perhaps I know myself better now," Daniel replied. "It's hard to share what you haven't yet discovered." "Do you ever regret how things turned out with Mom?" Daniel considered the question carefully. "I regret the pain, but not the outcome." Sometimes the path that seems most devastating leads to the most necessary growth. "I've been thinking about that a lot," Jason admitted. "About how we cling to what's comfortable, even when it's not what's best." "The hardest wisdom to learn," Daniel said, "is that loss often creates space for something more authentic to emerge." We're taught to fear endings, but they're merely thresholds to new beginnings. As they continued their meal, Daniel observed his son, not just the physical resemblance to himself, but the thoughtful quality that suggested Jason was absorbing these lessons in his own way, for his own journey. The true measure of strength, Daniel said softly, isn't found in never falling, but in how we rise after we've been broken, not in avoiding pain, but in finding meaning within it. Outside the window, the first stars appeared in the deepening blue sky, distant lights marking the continuity of existence beyond any single story's conclusion. Daniel recognized that his journey wasn't ending, but evolving, just as the silent signature on those divorce papers hadn't marked an ending, but a beginning, the first stroke in authoring a life of authentic choice and hard-won wisdom.